Imagine working 16 hours a day for a decade to build your dream restaurant from nothing, pouring every piece of yourself into every single dish, only for your best friend of 20 years to forge the ownership documents and sell the entire thing for $5 million dollars while you were still in the kitchen. That is exactly what happened to me. But Sarah made one critical mistake. She forgot that I never wrote a single recipe down. Not one. Everything I cooked, every secret blend, every technique, every dish that made that restaurant what it was, existed only in my head. And when I walked out the door, every last bit of it came with me. Welcome back to Secret Confessions, True Stories. If you love stories about ultimate betrayal and the kind of karma that arrives exactly when and how it should, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story. Now let me tell you exactly how my best friend destroyed her own life trying to steal mine. I grew up in my grandmother's kitchen. Not metaphorically. I mean, I was physically there, standing on a step stool at her counter from the time I could reach it, watching her hands move through the work of cooking, with the confidence of someone who had done it so long the knowledge had moved from her mind into her body. She never measured anything. She never opened a cookbook. She tasted and adjusted and responded to what was in front of her, with an intuition I absorbed without fully understanding what I was absorbing. By the time I was a teenager, I cooked the way she did. By the time I was in my 20s, I had taken everything she gave me and built something beyond it. Cooking was not what I did. It was what I was made of. Sarah came into my life at a dinner party in our mid-20s. We talked for 4 hours without noticing the time pass, which is the best possible indication that someone is going to matter to you. She had a business degree and the particular intelligence of someone who understands systems, how structures work, how money moves, how to turn an idea into an operation that can sustain itself. I could cook anything. She could build anything. For 12 years before we opened the restaurant, she was my closest friend, my sister in every way that counts, the person I called first in any situation. When we opened the restaurant together, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. The arrangement was clean. I ran the kitchen, she ran the business. I did not say this out loud as a formal agreement. It was simply the obvious division of what each of us was built for. I had no capacity for the paperwork and no desire to develop one. My domain was the stoves, the ingredients, the food that I had been thinking about my entire life. Her domain was everything that made the operation possible behind the scenes. What those first years looked like in the kitchen, I want you to understand clearly. 16-hour days are not a figure of speech when you are running a serious restaurant kitchen. They are a physical reality. Concrete floors that speak to your back in a language made entirely of complaints. Heat that doesn't relent even in winter. The specific and routine pain of burns that accumulate on your hands until the small scars become simply a feature of your palms rather than something you notice. I arrived before the staff and left after them. I went to markets at 5 in the morning to find the best of what was available. I woke up in the middle of the night thinking about flavor combinations and lay there working through problems until my alarm went off. Sarah sat in the air-conditioned office. I say this not with bitterness, but with simple, factual accuracy. She managed the accounts, the contracts, the supplier relationships, the filings, the legal documentation that kept us compliant and operational. I was genuinely grateful for this. I could not have done it, would not have done it, had no desire to do it. The paperwork was hers and the kitchen was mine, and the arrangement worked. Within 2 years, the restaurant was something that exceeded anything we had projected when we opened. A review in the main city publication, then a national outlet, then the specific self-sustaining momentum of word of mouth built on something that is genuinely excellent. People telling people, reservations filling weeks out, regular customers who drove from other cities and brought their families and their friends and their colleagues. The food was what brought them. The food was mine. Every dish, every sauce, every combination that had come together in those pre-dawn hours when I was working through something. And I never wrote any of it down. This is important and I want you to hold it. I cooked the way my grandmother cooked, without records, without measurements, without documentation of any kind. The dishes lived in my hands and my palate and my accumulated understanding of how ingredients behave with each other. I tried once to write down a recipe, and what I produced was a document that would not have produced the dish, because the dish exists in the doing of it, in 10,000 small adjustments that happen in real time. The recipes were in my head, only in my head, and that, as it turned out, was the detail that changed everything. The paperwork, Sarah handled. Every document I signed because Sarah handed it to me and told me where to put my name. I did not read what I signed. I want to be honest about this because there is no defense of it except the defense of trust, which is not a legal defense at all. She was my best friend and my business partner, and in 20 years, she had given me no reason to look for a gap between those two things. The signs were there in the year before everything happened. I know this now with the clarity of someone who has had time to go back through the months and identify each thing for what it was. The car appeared first, new, expensive, explained as a lease. The clothes followed, then the jewelry, pieces that were beyond what either of us was spending on ourselves in those years. She began taking calls outside the restaurant, standing in the parking lot with her back to the door, returning with a smoothed-over expression that I noticed but did not pursue. She was warm to my face and somehow not fully present even when she was in the room. I was too exhausted to investigate. That is the whole of it. A person working the hours I worked has very little energy left over for sustained suspicion, and I loved her, and it is easier to explain away the things you love than to look at them directly. The Monday morning it happened was an ordinary October morning. I arrived 45 minutes before the kitchen staff, the way I always did, to begin the preparation that only I did. The key did not turn in the lock. The lock was different. The security guards at the door were people I had never seen before. Sarah arrived 20 minutes later. She was wearing a suit. I noticed the suit because she never wore suits. She dressed practically, the comfortable layers of someone who moves between a kitchen and an office. The suit was deliberate. She had dressed for what she was about to do. I want to tell you what she said to me, and I want to tell it to you straight because I think it deserves to be heard clearly. The operating agreements I had signed over the years had been written to transfer sole legal ownership to her. My signatures were on them, real, not forged, put there by my own hand because she was my best friend and she handed me a pen and told me where to sign. The documents were legal. She had had them reviewed. She had sold the restaurant, the brand, the name, the location, the concept, the goodwill, everything, to a corporate hospitality group for $5 million. She handed me a check for $5,000. She called it a severance. Then she told me I could keep my knives. I want you to sit with that for a moment. $5,000 and my knives. For the restaurant I had built with my hands, for the decade of 16-hour days, for every dish that had put that restaurant on the map and kept it there and made it worth $5 million to a corporation that had never had anything to do with it. $5,000 and my knives, from the woman I had called my sister for 20 years. I stood on the sidewalk with the check and the box of knives and the feeling of someone whose body has received information that the mind is genuinely refusing to process. The panic attacks started that afternoon. They came in waves, sudden, physical, the specific breathlessness of someone whose context has been completely removed without warning. I could not eat, which is a particular irony for someone whose entire identity is organized around food. I could not sleep properly for weeks. I grieved the restaurant and I grieved Sarah simultaneously, and they were two separate griefs with different qualities, and they were both enormous, and they occupied me entirely for a long time. Because here's the thing about losing your life's work and your closest friend on the same day. It does not feel like one loss. It feels like the ground has been removed from underneath the entire structure of your life. Like everything you built and chose and invested in has been revealed to have been standing on something that was never what you thought it was. The restaurant was 20 years of effort. Sarah was 20 years of love. and she had used one to destroy the other, deliberately and with planning, and had handed me a check for $5,000 as though that was a reasonable exchange for both of them. The corporation moved quickly on their grand reopening. They had paid $5 million for a brand with an established reputation, and they intended to capitalize on it, to maintain the operation and build on the goodwill and expand the model into something that would justify the investment. They brought in their culinary team, professional, experienced, credentialed people who had worked in comparable settings and knew what they were doing. They were given the menu. There were no recipes. Not because I had taken them or hidden them or done anything deliberate. There simply were no records because there had never been any records, because I cook the way my grandmother cooked and have never approached a dish any other way. The spice blends that gave certain dishes their particular character existed in my memory and in my hands and nowhere else on earth. The technique adjustments, the specific timing, the combination of elements that made a dish what it was, all of it lived in the person who had been handed a check for $5,000 and told she could keep her knives. What the corporate chefs produced was food. Technically, it was food. But it was not the food that had built a waiting list measured in weeks, not the food that had brought food critics from other cities, not the food that had made people drive across the state to sit in a specific dining room and eat what came out of that specific kitchen. It was the shadow of what the dishes were supposed to be, competent in its construction and entirely without the thing that made it matter. The reviews began appearing within weeks of the reopening. The first was careful, measured, clearly written by someone who did not want to be the person who dismantled something beloved. By the third review, careful had given way to direct. By the fifth, the tone had become something between bewilderment and grief. Critics who had previously written about the restaurant in the language of genuine enthusiasm were now writing in the language of someone who has returned to a place they loved and found it unrecognizable. 1 star. On platforms where the restaurant had maintained a near-perfect rating for years, the reviews arriving under the new management told a story that was entirely consistent and entirely damaging. Customers who had been eating there since the beginning described what they were being served with the specific disappointment of people who had expected one thing and received something that bore its name but not its substance. Sarah called me. The first voicemail was reasonable in tone, friendly almost, as though the events of the Monday morning had not occurred and we were simply colleagues working through a problem. As the reviews continued, the voicemails changed. More urgent, then strained, then something I had genuinely never heard in her voice before, which was panic, real, uncontrolled, the sound of someone who has watched a plan begin to fail in ways they did not anticipate. I did not return the calls. I want to be clear that I did not return them because there was nothing to say. She had made her choices with full information and deliberate planning over a period of months or years, and she had looked me in the face on a Monday morning in October and handed me a check for $5,000 and told me I could keep my knives. I had nothing to offer that conversation. The corporation's legal team, reviewing the acquisition when it became clear that the investment was not performing, examined the original documentation. This is standard practice. When something you bought for a significant amount of money is not producing what you were told it would produce, you go back to the paperwork and look for the gap. What they found was that Sarah had represented herself as the sole owner of a business whose value was entirely dependent on a culinary identity that she had never actually possessed and had no ability to transfer. The forgery issues in the original operating agreements, examined now with the attention that legal disputes bring, showed irregularities that had not been visible in casual review. The lawsuit was for $5 million. Fraud and misrepresentation. The accounts were frozen as part of the proceedings, which meant the car and the clothes and the jewelry and the life assembled over the months before the lockout became subject to legal attention in ways that complicated the enjoyment of them. The criminal charges for forgery were separate from the civil matter and carried their own timeline and their own potential consequences. I heard about this through people who were common to both of us. I will not pretend I felt nothing when I heard, because that would not be honest. What I felt was complicated. There was something that was not satisfaction but was adjacent to it, and underneath it, something that was simply sadness. The specific sadness of watching someone you loved for 20 years arrive at the consequences of a choice they made. Both things were true simultaneously. The CEO came to my apartment on a Tuesday morning in March. He was direct and professional, and he had clearly thought carefully about what he was going to say before he said it. He said that the acquisition had been based on representations that had not proven to be accurate. He said that the value of the brand resided in a culinary creator whose contribution had not been transferred in the sale and could not have been transferred in the way it was represented. He said he was there to propose a renegotiated arrangement that he hoped I would consider. I told him I would involve my attorney, whom I had hired in the weeks following the lockout, paid for out of the $5,000 severance. She had reviewed my situation and had a very clear sense of its value. The terms we negotiated were these: an executive chef contract with compensation that was not comparable to anything I had been paid in the preceding decade. Full intellectual property ownership of every recipe, technique, and culinary development, past, present, and future, meaning that what existed in my memory and my hands was legally mine and could not be used without my explicit authorization. And 50% equity in the brand going forward, meaning that the appreciation of the rebuilt reputation would belong to me in proportion to what I had always actually contributed. I read every document, every line. The morning I walked back into the kitchen was in October, almost exactly 1 year from the morning I had stood outside it with a box of knives and a check that was an insult. The kitchen had been maintained. The equipment was clean. The staff who had been hired in my absence were professional and willing, and simply had not had access to what made the food what it was. I put on my apron. I began to cook. And what came out of that kitchen was the food that people had been waiting for. The reviews, when they came after the second reopening, said that something had returned. One of them said that the restaurant seemed to have recovered its soul. I think that is accurate. I want to tell you what I take from this story, not as a lesson I want to impose on you, but as the honest conclusion I arrived at after living through it. You cannot forge what I have. You cannot put it in a legal document or transfer it in a sale or take it from someone with a pen and a notarized signature. It is knowledge that was passed to me at a kitchen counter by a woman who never measured anything, accumulated over 50 years of doing the work, inseparable from the person who holds it. When I walked out the door, it walked out with me. When I walked back in, it walked back in with me. And no amount of money or planning or deliberate betrayal was ever going to change that. Sarah took everything she could take, and what she discovered, at a cost that has only continued to compound, is that the thing that made everything worth anything was the one thing she could never touch. True talent is not a document. It cannot be purchased or forged or transferred. It lives in the hands of the person who developed it. And when that person decides they are done being taken for granted, it leaves with them and waits until they are ready to come back on their own terms. I came back as a millionaire and a 50% owner on a Tuesday morning in October to a kitchen that was mine in ways no paperwork had ever been able to confirm and no paperwork had ever been able to deny. That is the recipe. And as I said from the beginning, I'm keeping it. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. If this story moved you, please leave a comment below and tell me what you thought. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. There are more stories like this one coming, and you do not want to miss them. I'll see you in the next confession.